I want to cut across directly to my colleague Gaurav Sawant, tracking details, joining us live from Kyiv. Gaurav, this possibly could be the first step in maybe the end of war. Does it come because for the first time, Ukraine itself, the president of Ukraine, has said those two big sticking points of it being neutral and of the nation of the territory which Russia has labeled as independent territory, those 2 points are no longer non-negotiable for Ukraine.
Preeti, you're absolutely right. There is some hope because Russia also announced a regime of silence in 5 cities, and where we are right now in Kyiv, while air raid sirens may have gone off a couple of times earlier this morning, but right now there is relative ease and it's palpable. People are out of their homes, they're in supermarkets, they're shopping, they're stocking up. There are some vehicles that you see on the roads behind me, and this is because there is this hope that with the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky now talking about not being on a bent knee to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the fact that they're talking about Crimea and Donetsk region, the Donbass region, Donetsk and Luhansk, some conciliation there, accepting it as Russian territory, a major climb down. But if you look around, you still see military hardware, you see military trucks and convoys moving for the protection of Kiev. Now, these are roads that are leading into Kiev. So while there is some progress, some forward movement, the Russian threat still remains. Russia appears to be closing in from all sides, and a lot of military hardware that was now in several other regions, Preeti, is now moving closer for the defense of Kiev in the days ahead. So if the negotiations that are happening between Ukraine, Russia and Turkey, if they take off tomorrow, if it leads to something, then yes, there is hope. If not, then this regime of silence may just lead to a lot of military hardware being poofed off, which we'll hear in and around Kyiv, like we did in Bucha and Irpin yesterday, Preeti.
You know, this is the biggest news, Gaurav, one would say, that has come in till now. For the first time, there seems to be a thaw in relationship where Ukraine and Russia is concerned. Gaurav, I have 2 questions for you. Like you pointed out, that also it has a lot to do with Ukraine, stepping back. Ukraine stepped back from its non-negotiables, because both were sticking forward. But the other big question, how big a role in this is Turkey playing? Because things have only changed and shifted once Turkey stepped in to negotiate.
Preeti, the threat is big. The Russian assault has been severe so far, but severe in places like Kharkiv, severe in places like Sumy, severe in places around Kiev. Now, the fact that the Ukraine army and air force, it fought very hard. It fought very hard and held on for 14 days. The question remains, how long can they continue to hold on, especially when the red lines are now shrinking and the red lines are becoming sharper and closer to the capital, Kiev. Earlier when we were here, we've been traveling across this country for the past 20 days now. Earlier, the security was in much further areas. They were far beyond Kiev. Now those checkpoints and pickets and defense lines are moving inwards, and that is an indication that all the military hardware, all the resources that were earlier for the protection of the country are now shrinking for the protection of the national capital, Kiev, including air defense assets, surface-to-air missiles, anti-tank guided missiles, and even infantry combat vehicles and tanks. They are now, their cordon is shrinking while they're fighting in Irpin, while they're fighting in Bucha. Their ultimate realization is this entire fight is for the defense of Kiev, and perhaps President Zelensky wants to stall or avert the inevitable, and to stall and avert the inevitable, he's willing to give in to these Russian demands of not being a part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and that give on Crimea and the Donbass region. But will this satisfy Russia now that they're so close? I mean, they're virtually at the gates of Kyiv. Will they want to prolong this, move in for the final assault, and it may just be very, very bloody in the days ahead, or accept negotiation? And will they accept Zelensky still being in the chair, or will they insist that he goes and then negotiations are taken forward? All of that happens in the days ahead, Preeti.
You know, Gaurav, but the fact is now there's going to be acute moral pressure, not that there wasn't earlier, but now, you know, that moral pressure is only going to be amplified because Ukraine has stepped back. Ukraine was the first one to blink. And, you know, Ukraine has stepped back. Now, Russia would need to follow because till now, their main two sticking points were the neutral status of Ukraine not joining NATO. And the other point was, of course, which we spoke about, of the territories occupied as Russia being independent territories. If Ukraine has stepped back, then Russia would need to accept, you know, at least on the face of it.
So there were two aims of Russia's war in Ukraine. One was regime change. President Zelensky has to change, that his dispensation has to go. Second was demilitarization, or as the Russians put it, denazification of this country. Both aims haven't been met just as yet. While they are close, you know, it's very close and yet very far. President Zelensky remains in office. President Zelensky does to an extent remain defiant. He did say that this is my address, this is where I am, I have not run away from this country. And he does have the support of at least the fighting forces in this country and a lot of other people who are standing by with the forces even when the Russians are virtually at the gates of Kyiv. So Russian aims haven't been met just as yet. Now, will those aims be met through negotiations? And to perhaps succeed in negotiations, you need that big gun. And that is why the Russians seem to be closing in on Kiev. They will negotiate. They will negotiate for a regime change. They will negotiate that NATO weapons leave this country, and because that is a big threat to Russian supremacy in this region. Remember, it is those Javelin anti-tank guided missiles and the Stinger surface-to-air missiles, and of course, a lot of other Soviet-era hardware that the Ukrainian armed forces have been using. But the fact that they've held on to their territory for 14 days, the fact that despite all the Russian weapons being amassed at the borders, they did not give up, is an indication that this army and this country has changed from 2014 to 2022. So they may still continue to fight on. Russian aims haven't been met, and moral victory or moral issues don't really matter here. The way operations have been conducted with clinical military precision, of course with major gaps in places. It remains to be seen over the next 24 to 48 hours what these negotiations lead to, and whether after those negotiations the armies that are amassed at the borders of Kyiv move in for the kill.
One final question, Gaurav, before I let you go. President Zelensky, this time around, in his last address, it started from backing NATO, it started from lauding the West for support. Then, the desperation you could sense in his voice, where he kept saying, that this is a desperate appeal, that the West, steps up from where it was, close the skies. Desperate appeals went to him. Then, ultimately to issue ultimatums. And now it seems complete disillusionment where President Zelensky is concerned when you look to the West.
Preeti, you're spot on. President Zelensky would be a very disappointed man. The kind of support he enjoyed from the West, the kind of promises that were made by the West, the West literally egged him on to take on Russia, and and the kind of writings that were there, that here is one David that's taking on the Goliath and the works. All of that, end of the day, it's the might of the Russian armed forces versus Ukraine, backed by other countries. But what is the ground reality? The ground reality is, when Ukraine desperately asked for fighter jets, what did Poland do? Poland said, we will place all our fighting, MiG-29s, all the best condition MiG-29s that they have, the ones that are operational in their Air Force, they'll place them at the Ramstein airfield in Germany, and you can pick it up from Germany. But America has to give corresponding, Western-era aircraft, which are airworthy and have a airframe life and engine life, to Poland. Now, while all of that happens, what does Ukraine do? How can Ukraine pick up fighter jets from Germany and then fight here? Where will the weapons come from? Where will the fuel come from? Where will those aircraft land? There are so many issues. It's only lip service. Perhaps that's the realization that is also dawning, that while a lot of promises were made by the West, those promises were not fulfilled. And some here have started arguing, maybe not on camera as yet, that it's the West that led President Zelensky and Ukraine up the garden path and then let them hanging by a very slender thread. And Russia is now tightening the noose, because Russia has a lot of military hardware. Apart from the 500 odd missiles that they've poofed off in 14 days, they have a lot of hardware now to focus on. Kyiv. Is joining NATO worth it for Ukraine at this stage? And that is why he's saying, I'm not going to NATO on a bent knee or on my knees begging them to take Ukraine. Now, there's a climb down on his part. Will that climb down result in satisfying or pacifying Russia? Remains to be seen at a time when Russia actually smells maybe victory in if not very in the next couple of days, but as some war games indicate, in the next week to 10 days they will have Kyiv on its knees. Will they want that with the bloodshed, or a regime change without that bloodshed is the issue ahead?
Appreciate you joining us, Gaurav. We're going to come back to you for more updates on that story. My colleague Gaurav Sawant reporting on what could very well be the beginning of a breakthrough. This is very important, viewers. If we focus till now, all we've seen is hostility from both sides, where Ukraine and Russia is concerned. For the first time in the last 24 hours, we have seen some thawing of relationships. Primarily, it started from Ukraine President Zelensky stepping back first on the two biggest non-negotiables that there have been for Ukraine and Russia. Will Russia, the onus is on Russia, but Russia has really not played, to traditional moral pressure, because there's been tremendous amounts of it through the course of this war. But will Russia now step back and come to the talking table? What's really happened right now is that Russia has come up and clearly said that for the first time, there seems to be a breakthrough. That's big, big news.